The Holy Gospel according to Matthew, the 5th chapter. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way, they persecuted the prophets who were before you." The Gospel of the Lord. It's been almost a week since I deleted the social media apps on my phone. At some point, I finally realized that my 6 a.m. doom scrolling was not only a miserable way to begin my day, but that it was actually impacting my mental health. I was learning nothing new from the breathless barrage of think pieces about the election, but I was exhausting my overloaded nervous system with headlines and takeaways that kept my body awash in adrenaline, with nowhere to flee and no one to fight. I faced a similar decision once again last night, choosing to break my quadrennial tradition of staying awake through the long hours of the night to wait for an announcement of the projected winner in the presidential election, or at least the determination that no winner could yet be declared. Instead, as it became clear that we would not know for another day or longer, I took myself to bed and prayed for the gift of sleep. In place of all the panic-inducing media, I have been attempting to meditate for a few minutes each day, to order my thoughts and return to myself. Sitting a few days ago, listening to a guided meditation, I was invited to reflect on the divine qualities of loving kindness, compassion, joy, and equanimity by inviting the memory of someone who has loved me unconditionally to come to mind. Then I was asked to imagine that person speaking to me, addressing me with the following statements. May you be caring toward your own body and mind. May you see your own limits compassionately. May joy fill and nourish you always. May you be open to the true nature of life. Sitting in silence, imagining my mother's voice, speaking words of blessing and hope I could feel my body come back to life, my heart expand, my mind shaking off its fears, and my soul reaching forward, addressed by the memory of love, things that seemed impossible only minutes before now seemed within reach. This is how I imagine the crowd might have received Jesus' words of blessing, his Beatitudes, as he began the Sermon on the Mount. For much of my life, I've heard the Beatitudes as a sort of index of salvation, a catalog of the qualities I would need to develop in order to find favor with God. It didn't matter that I was raised with and confirmed into a clear knowledge of salvation by grace through faith, because I was also being formed in a parallel process by the world's catechism of competition and consumerism, self-reliance and scarcity. I knew that God is good. I feared that I was not good enough. It's taken time, years really, of listening to people's stories, for me to not only understand, but to really trust that I'm not alone in my fears and self-doubts. The world has not hurt us all in the same way, nor to the same extent. But we have all been wounded. Some have been taught to hate themselves, and some have been taught that hate is the price of belonging. Some have been taught to expect nothing but sorrow, and others that grief is an unacceptable weakness. Some have been taught to make themselves small, and others to align themselves with greatness. Our wounds, these patterns and habits, we inherited them so early that it was easy enough to confuse them with our very selves. They function as prisons, and sometimes we collude with them by confusing them with the deepest truth about ourselves, becoming collaborators with our own oppression. Each of the Gospels chooses its own way to present the beginning of Jesus' ministry that says something about how it understands Jesus. Mark begins with an exorcism, Luke with a sermon before the hometown crowd, John with the miracle at Cana. And here in the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount is presented as the summary of what Jesus has been teaching as he moved throughout the Galilee. It functions as a sort of inaugural address. Matthew's Jesus comes to us in the form of a teacher. Like Moses descending Mount Sinai with the life-giving law, Jesus calls the disciples and addresses the crowd as an instructor in righteousness. And so, as any good teacher knows, you have to meet the students where they are and build on what they've previously been taught. This means that for Jesus, the first lesson is to address head-on their miseducation on the topic of their value as human beings and where they stand in God's economy. When Jesus calls out the categories of blessing, blessed are the poor in spirit, the mourners, the meek, he isn't presenting the ruler by which the crowd will be measured. He's describing the people in front of him. The crowds that followed Jesus from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan were hungering and thirsting for righteousness. They were the poor and the persecuted, the meek and the mourners. They might have been familiar with the text of Psalm 70, and they were certainly familiar with the lament that it voices. But I am poor and needy. Hasten to me, O God. You are my help and my deliverer. O Lord, do not delay. And so here is where I want to pause and return to the reality of the moment we are living in as we gather for worship this morning. It is the day after the election, and there is no clear outcome yet. We are waiting. But we're not just waiting for the votes to be counted. We're waiting for justice. We're waiting for an end to the hatred and division that have ripped our neighborhoods and our nation apart. We are waiting for families separated at the border to be reunited. We're waiting for an end to police brutality directed at and the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. We are waiting for a real response to the all-encompassing crisis of climate change. We are waiting for the basic preconditions of an abundant life, clean water, housing, and healthcare to stop being treated as luxury commodities and redistributed as the birthright of all God's children. We are waiting for the dismantling of nuclear armaments that have not gone away, even if we've stopped talking about them. We are waiting for homes free from domestic violence and workplaces free from harassment. We are waiting for that day when the sacred reality of queer people's relationships and trans and non-binary people's lives are not up for debate in our churches or our courthouses. We are waiting for an end to the diseases and health conditions that do not impact us all equally. We are waiting for the end of COVID, and we are waiting and waiting and waiting, and we don't know how much longer we can wait. O Lord, do not delay. May you be caring toward your own body and mind. May you see your own limits compassionately. May joy fill and nourish you always. May you be open to the true nature of life. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the commonwealth of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be filled. Blessed are the merciful. They will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart. They will perceive God. Blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Theirs is the commonwealth of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account, rejoice, be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Blessed are you. Blessed are you. Blessed are you. Imagine it now. Form the picture in your mind. See the face. Hear the voice speaking to you from the heart of God's love. Blessed are you. Feel your heart open. Let your body unclench. Shake the fears from your mind. Yearn your soul towards its future. Jesus, the teacher, has many lessons to teach and many assignments to give. Later on, he will tell them about the power of small things, seeds and yeast and mustard trees. Later on, they will learn what happens when you plant this gospel in the ground. But today, while the crowds have gathered round and the whole world is waiting, Jesus blesses those who would follow him with words of compassion and loving kindness and patience and joy. Finally, a postscript on joy. We're trying to do many things, perhaps too many things, with today's worship service. It's not only the day after the election, but it's also the day on which we are observing All Saints' Day. Very shortly, we will read aloud as part of the prayers of the people the names of those who have died in the last year. Here at LSTC, we are grieving the deaths of the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Perrow and the Reverend Paul Landau, losses that evoke the memory of other saints from this community who now rest in God's power and presence. These names represent the smallest fraction of those whose lives have now ended. Some welcomed their deaths at the end of long lives, well lived. Nevertheless, they are missed. Some had their lives stolen from them by acts of violence, the acute violences of murder and abuse, and the chronic violences of oppression and neglect. This year, we are especially mindful of all the lives that were taken by the COVID pandemic, losses which in many cases might have been preventable. We are not only mourning, but we are raging. In the context of that grief and anger, joy may feel out of place. Take, for example, the hymn that will send us out at the closing of worship this morning, When the Saints Go Marching In. Given all that we are suffering right now, how can we take part in singing a song whose joy can barely be contained by its Dixieland melody? Let me suggest, however, that joy is a revolutionary act, precisely at moments like this. Joy is written into the creeds that accompany the act of baptism, the declaration that though Jesus was born under Pontius Pilate, suffered death and was buried, that on the third day, he rose again and ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God, and that we are those who look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world yet to come. Joy is our rebellion against every voice that has ever told us to sit down and shut up. Joy is the shape of the pruning hook for which we traded our spears. Joy is the sound of the shackles falling from our feet. Joy is our soul's response to the voice of Jesus, speaking from the heart of God, calling us blessed. Amen.